Stephen Kenny joins me now from our Adelaide studios. Mr. Kenny, thanks very much for talking to Afternoon Live. What does David Hicks himself say about this development?
Well, of course, he's incredibly pleased about it. It is a very significant development, and it's one that he'd hope will be applied to him. So he's very buoyed by the decision, and he's very keen to get on with making the same application in the United States courts himself.
OK, as you say, he wants to make an application in the court. What sort of legal doors does this decision open for him?
Well, it's a precedent for his case. I mean, he was convicted of the same charge that Hamdan was convicted of. It had the same retrospective effect that the court found objectionable, and consequently I believe that David's conviction will be set aside, despite the fact that he was forced to enter into a guilty plea.
OK, well, potentially his conviction could be set aside, as you say. What other kind of redress would he be entitled to, in your view, and how can you go about achieving that redress if it is achievable?
Well, that's a more complicated question. The issue of compensation is a lot further down the track, but I think there is a real issue of the Australian government's involvement in this matter. The Howard government were very active in David's case, and the question is really, what role did they play? Has he a claim for compensation against the Australian government? They're all things that we'll look at.
OK, what about the argument that David Hicks's conviction can't be set aside because he entered into a plea deal and thus waived his right to challenge his conviction?
Well, there's a couple of things about that. Firstly, he was forced to enter into the plea effectively by duress. I mean, he had been in Guantanamo Bay for approximately 5 years, much of it in solitary confinement, and the treatment there, we know, would be enough to make any person plead to anything to get out of there, which is effectively what happened to David. He was never a supporter of terrorism, and he certainly does not believe he was guilty of any offence. And his plea was always something that ranked with him, and now this is a real opportunity for him to clear his name, and I think that that ultimately is what will happen.
OK, a moment ago we quoted from the statement the Australian government has put out in response to this development. Have you seen that statement, and what's your reaction to it?
No, I haven't seen the statement. I heard part of what you said, and I would think that the Australian government should look very seriously at what role the Howard government took in David's incarceration. I mean, we know that if they had asked for him to be returned home to Australia, the Americans would have, as they did with the Brits. The real question we have is did they delay his return to Australia? Did the Americans offer to send him back? Did the Australian government then delay and cause him to be detained for a further period in Guantanamo Bay? They're all things that I think are very relevant, and I think require a full investigation of the matter. OK, well, you say a full investigation, a serious look that you've called for. Just how serious do you mean, Stephen Kenny? I mean, should there be a Royal Commission, for example, into the way the Australian government handled this matter? Look, I think it's serious enough to call for a Royal Commission. I think it has some serious implications for Australian servicemen and women, that if they're ever caught up in a conflict, would they like the Geneva rules applied to them, or would they like the Guantanamo Bay rules applied? I think we need to work out exactly what happened to ensure that this never happens again to any other Australian citizen.
What sort of resources can David Hicks call on to set aside his conviction? I think you've foreshadowed it could take years to get such an action through the US courts.
That's exactly right. It could take years, and he doesn't have the resources. I mean, we'll be relying on a lot of pro bono work by a number of lawyers here in Australia and in the United States. But that's what we relied upon before, and it is something that is worthy of some serious pro bono effort.
OK, Stephen Kenny, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much.